In today's video, we're going to continue our discussion of the Four Noble Truths and look at the third Noble Truth today. In our last video, we looked at the second Noble Truth, the Noble Truth of the origin of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and we saw that that origin was in craving. I'll leave a link to that video down below if you haven't seen it already. And basically what we saw is that we tend to crave certain things. In particular, we crave the permanence of those things that we find pleasurable or good. And we sort of crave, if you like, the permanent extinction of those things that we find unpleasurable or bad. However, as I think is pretty clear, the world doesn't cooperate with our cravings, which is what makes life seem unsatisfactory. That is to say, things that we find pleasurable don't stick around in general, and things that we find unpleasurable or painful, well, they tend to show up all the time. So there's no way out of them. And we have to, in particular, deal with the realities in life, such as illness, old age, and death. These are things that we cannot avoid. And we saw that the task associated with that second noble truth was to abandon that kind of craving, the kind of craving that makes our life seem unsatisfactory. And the question for us today is, what happens when we abandon that craving? When we do, we find a true kind of freedom opens up in front of us. And that freedom is described as the cessation of suffering. And so the third noble truth is the noble truth of cessation, or the Pali word is nirodha. And so, as in the previous two, what I want to do is to look at how the Buddha analyzed or defined this third noble truth in what is purported to be his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And then what we'll do is I'll give you the definition or what he has to say about it, and then we'll go through it sort of phrase by phrase, trying to understand it, what he means in a little more detail. So, what the Buddha had to say was, now this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, that is, the same craving we discussed in the second noble truth, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. So we might say that this noble truth is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering through the cessation of craving, if you like. I mean, both of them have to cease, or rather, the craving has to cease in order that the suffering may cease as well. So, what does the Buddha mean here? What is he talking about? Well, first, he says, this is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving. Now, there's actually a lot there. As I've already mentioned, when he says that same craving, he means that he's talking about the same one he was before in the second noble truth. It's that same craving that has to cease. Now, what he means here is that during our practice, during our lives, we may see that craving for sense pleasures, for continued existence, and so on. We may see that fade away during our practice, during our meditation, or during our daily life. That we all of a sudden, at least for a time or a moment even, find that we don't crave these things right now. We don't crave more sense pleasures right now. We've had enough of them. Or we don't crave continued existence, eternal existence. We don't need it. We don't either need to be extinguished. We just are happy with the way things are. That is the kind of thing that the Buddha is pointing to here. That's the kind of experience he's pointing to. Now, for myself, I'll say that every once in a while during meditation or some kind of practice, I'll get a glimpse of something like this, but when the Buddha is talking here, he's talking about a remainderless fading away. That is to say that every bit of that craving fades away. There's nothing left of the craving. And I don't know that I personally have ever experienced such a thing. I get the feeling that when craving fades away in my experience, there's usually a subtle residue of it somewhere there. It's just that the more gross or unsubtle types of craving have faded away, and what's left is very subtle kinds of craving. And that itself can be at least for me, can be a source of feeling great freedom. So we don't have to be too strict about this, we can see advances in our practice even though we don't necessarily experience the entire force of the Third Noble Truth. Nevertheless, the Buddha is pointing to an experience here that is really quite profound, and if you're able to get yourself there, so much the better. And the Buddha goes on to discuss the giving up and relinquishing of that craving. And this is an interesting phrasing because it suggests, when he says giving up and relinquishing of this craving, it suggests that we ordinarily have a sense of possession or ownership over our cravings, that we identify with them. And I think, honestly, I think this is a very, very deep and incisive awareness on the Buddha's part, because I think it's true that we ourselves, we tend to identify with our cravings, either with the objects of them or with the craving itself, that we feel like it's who we are to crave, that it's sort of like people will often say that, craving makes life great, right? I mean, because I don't think they've looked at it very deeply, but in any event, they identify with their craving. They think of the craving as who they are. They think of the object of the craving, the good things, as sort of reflecting who they are or who they want to be. And ordinarily, we do tend to identify ourselves with those parts of the world that we find pleasant, that we find that give us pleasure, right? And we identify ourselves in opposition to those parts of the world that don't, that we find unpleasurable. So we may think of ourselves, let's say, as nature lovers, as people close to the trees in the forest, that those are who we are, that we cling to them. And in opposition to, let's say, pollution, that we think of as not who we are, that we think of as bad and other, and that has to be extinguished. What I'm saying is that this can be the case even with things that are actually good and bad, right? But it gets more problematic as we come to our views about them, our beliefs, because we also identify ourselves very strongly with our views and our opinions and our beliefs. And those views that we find pleasurable and good, we identify with, we think of as who we are. And the views that we find as distasteful or painful or wrong or bad, we identify ourselves in contradistinction to those. So part of what the Buddha is saying here is that in giving up craving, in relinquishing craving, we have to relinquish not only our ordinary cravings, but also our tendency to cling to and crave certain kinds of beliefs and views and opinions. Next, the Buddha talks about freedom from craving. And indeed, before this stage, we're ordinarily bound by our cravings. Now, oftentimes we don't think of our cravings as kinds of bondage, as kinds of limits on our freedom. Again, many of us identify with our cravings and think that by craving things we're becoming more free, but in fact the opposite is true. Our cravings bind us to do certain things that may be indeed against our own best interest, and indeed often are. They end up being essentially kinds of addiction. Either literal addictions to things such as smoking or drinking or drugs or habits of certain kinds, gambling, or addictions which may not be strictly speaking addictions in the sort of a clinical sense, but are addictions in a more general sense, are addictions to certain kinds of pleasure, for example. So, for example, we may have a kind of an addiction or craving for certain luxuries in our lives. And our craving for those luxuries may cause us to engage in soul-crushing work. We may realize that the only way we're going to be able to afford those kinds of luxuries is if we sacrifice our lives to a certain kind of work schedule that crushes us internally, or that requires us to make certain kinds of ethical compromises, that causes us deep stress, that burns us out. But we see our prize as these great experiences that are going to happen way down the line in 10 years, 20 years when we retire. And so we're willing to undergo these decades of problem, of difficulty, of sadness, in order to get what are essentially fleeting and themselves unsatisfactory ends. And this is an example of the way that cravings can lead to bondage over long, long periods of time in our lives. And indeed, gaining freedom from such cravings can lead to a much more expansive and healthy approach to life, one where we're living much more right now and worried less about sacrificing things that are perhaps better for us now in order to gain some thing that in the future is really not as good as we crack it up to be. In other words, living in a much more expansive and genuine sense right now, and worried less about cravings that bind us to things that we don't need to be doing. And then the Buddha mentions non-reliance on such craving, because ordinarily we actually rely on these cravings to give our lives a kind of purpose. That is, we don't usually think of it this way, but in fact we do rely on our cravings to steer our lives, that many of us might think that without cravings our lives would be kind of rudderless. And so we require these cravings, we rely upon them to give us purpose in our lives. The problem is that these cravings give us inevitably unskillful purpose, the wrong purpose, a very narrow purpose that is focused upon things that are not to our long-term benefit, that are in fact unsatisfactory when we actually achieve them. And so it's by giving up, relinquishing our reliance upon these cravings to give our life aim or purpose, that we can actually open up our lives to a greater purpose, to a wiser purpose. And so all of this encompasses what the Buddha said was the experience of enlightenment or nirvana, which is the complete and permanent cessation of greed, of hatred, and of ignorance or of delusion. Now, do we see this as a literal possibility for us in this very life? Or do we see it as, we might say, a wonderful ideal towards which to strive? I don't think it really matters for now, because for most of us, this is going to be something that's very, very far off in the future at the very least. But I think it's something to keep in mind, that is the real aim that we're looking for, the way that we should really be steering our lives, as opposed to steering it based on one or another kind of craving. In any event, as I've said in the past two, each of these Four Noble Truths comes with its own associated task. So what is the task in the case of the Third Noble Truth? Well, that task is one of realization. What the Buddha says is, this noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. If we can realize such a cessation for even a moment during our lives or our practice, that's wonderful. But even if we don't realize complete cessation for a moment, I think many of us, if we've done practice for a while, will understand that the cravings do tend to diminish. And so to that degree, our practice reveals to us its own success or its own potential usefulness to us. And the question then becomes, what is the proper practice? How should we practice in ways to be able to experience this kind of realization? And that subject, the proper practice, is the subject of the Fourth Noble Truth, which will be our next video. And when that video is ready, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, take a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to try to support the channel. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon, and thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.